And we are good. Okay. Back to the page I need to be on. Put everybody in the corner for our little Brady Bunch view. Oh, and of course I left it. Okay. Back to the page. There we go. Too many buttons to push. All right. Well, let's get down to work with that little delay. We are picking up from our conversation about Sura'at. We are in Meztora. Oftentimes, Tazria Meztora are a double parshiot, but this year, because of the leap year, they are spread out. So we get to talk about this for longer than usual, which I know most people consider to be a negative thing, because the topic of Sura'at, often translated as leprosy, incorrectly, is not one that fills people with much passion, spiritual uplift, or a sense of bettering the world or themselves. As I've argued over the years, that is not the right conclusion to come from these sections, but I certainly do agree that they can be a little more impenetrable than other sections of Torah. So we're going to look at this topic of Sura'at, and just to whet your appetite, I'm going to lay it out at the beginning that we're going to end up talking about the very nature of miracles and angels in general. So this is not going to just be a dull examination of a skin condition. So let's see if we can't get there together. Chapter 14, verse 1. Adonai spoke to Moshe, saying, "This is to be the instruction regarding one with Sura'at. At the time of his being purified, he is to be brought to the priest." All right, just a little quick update there. We are now talking about how one goes from having the condition of Sura'at to no longer having the condition of Sura'at. And this is after the period of examination, when it is clear that it's not there. And then these are the steps they'll go through. This, of course, indicates, as I have said many, many times, that Sura'at is not leprosy. Leprosy was not curable in the pre-modern times. That was not something that was easily handled by the medical ability of the ancient world. Sura'at clearing up here seems to be being done on a metaphysical level. As such, it is very clear that this is not a standard biological illness. But let's see what happens at the time when the purification. The priest is to look, and there and here, should the affliction of Sura'at have healed on the one with Sura'at, the priest is to command that they take for the one to be purified 2 birds, live, pure, and wood of cedar and scarlet of the worm, and hyssop. So these are various ingredients that are going to be put together in order to perform the ritual. Then the priest is to command that they slay the one bird in an earthen vessel held above living water, Mayim Chayim. You can go back and watch my Mishnah class where we talk about this Mayim Chayim concept in much more detail. And the live bird, he is to take it, and the cedar wood, and the scarlet of the worm, and the hyssop, and is to dip them and the live bird in the blood of the slaughtered bird held above the living water. So we've got 2 birds. One of them is slaughtered. The blood from that is used to paint, if you will, the bird that remains, the living bird, and all of this is being performed around the Mayim Chayim, around this water. Verse 7, then he is to sprinkle it over the one to be purified of Sura'at 7 times, and declare him pure, and is to send out the live bird into the open field. All right, so this has purified the one that had been ritually impure of the highest level, and we have to ask ourselves, why? Well, first of all, before we can even ask that question, I want to make sure that we caught the mental sleight of hand that many people fall into, the trap that many people fall into. Many people read the rituals that are being outlined here in these verses as being rituals to cure the one that is suffering from Sura'at. That is not the case. If we go back up to our verse 3, and we see that the phrase literally says, "V'hinei mirpa," and behold, he has been healed, right? That he is no longer suffering from Sura'at. But Sura'at is not what is being healed by this ritual. The ritual impurity is what is being removed by this ritual. That Tzara'at has to already be gone before this ritual can take place. If he is still suffering from Tzara'at, then this ritual, if it were performed, would have no effect whatsoever. The ritual is only here to ratify that indeed the Tzara'at is gone, but most importantly, that this person's status as being tahor, ritually pure, is now being returned to that normal level after having been pushed to the very extremes of being tameh, of being ritually impure. But it is very easy to read this section with all of the sacrifices, the blood, and the birds as being some kind of healing ritual. But this is not a healing ritual at all. And to read it as such would be misleading and, unfortunately, unhelpful. Because then one would think that the only way to be cured would be to go through this ritual. And that is not what is happening. Verse 3, in fact, tells us that the way to be cured is to no longer have it. Now, we're going to come back to how to get cured in a little bit, but I just want to make sure that we've got that nice and clear. Because if we misunderstand what's going on in this ritual, we really do fall into the trap that so many have held on to for thousands of years. So if you have followed the story of leprosy in general, you'll know that, unfortunately, many cultures have adopted the rules laid out here in Vayikra as though they were talking about the actual medical condition leprosy, and have stigmatized those with leprosy in a way that those suffering from other conditions were not. Right up into the 20th century, even after curative treatments had begun to be introduced, there were people who still stigmatized the idea of leprosy or refused to seek treatment because they refused to believe that God would punish them with this disease. We need to understand that that is not what is happening here, and that is not what is happening with anyone suffering from the modern condition. That instead, leprosy is its own biological issue, and this is its own spiritual issue that may manifest through a physical representation. So we need to keep that clear in order that everyone can get the treatment that they need. Now, it may be that Tzara'at is no longer in our world, something that our sages agree upon, that this is not a currently functioning illness that we need to be concerned for, but we still need to learn the lessons of it in order to recognize how we do deal with other conditions, whether they be spiritual or biological, in our current time period. Okay, with that, we've got a lot of some beefy topics to get through, so we're going to jump into our commentary. Now that we've looked at the ritual of removing the ritual impurity, let's take a look at how our ancestors have considered this whole topic of Tzara'at in general. And now I will apologize. We are going to be looking at a different part of the Torah, but it's okay that we haven't read it together. This is coming from Deuteronomy 24, where the topic of Tzara'at comes up again with a little bit more flavor in some of the content of the commentaries that we need to borrow on. So there we hear in Deuteronomy that we must be most careful in the matter of Tzara'at, the skin affliction, to which Da'at Zekenim, one of the great commentators, replies, the reason why the Torah repeats the same warning twice is because this disease is apt to afflict everyone, kings not excepted. King Uzziyahu was afflicted by it, as we know from 2 Chronicles 26. Being afflicted by this disease is most shameful, so that even if he is a king, he must remain in isolation and cannot function in his palace, and must be obedient to what the priest tells him concerning the length of time of this disease. So, Da'at Zekenim, and this echoes many other commentaries as well, is pointing out that this extra emphasis on our caution in dealing with the issue of Tzara'at is to highlight the fact that this is not an illness that only affects one portion of the population that we might be tempted to look down upon, but this can indeed affect those at the top of the social hierarchy as well. Indeed, even the king, who is used to having no one tell him what to do, is subjected to this particular illness, and as such, he is put into a position of obedience vis-a-vis the Kohen, who will be able to tell him exactly how he goes through the process of being isolated and then waiting for the tzara'at to be cured. So this is indeed something that is quite powerful and potent. But as Rambam points out in his Mishnah Torah, which is the next section, which I can't quite get on one screen, tzara'at is a name given collectively to many different matters that are not similar to each other. So he is saying something that you probably have come to recognize, but maybe didn't feel comfortable stating out loud. Rambam is great for saying things out loud that the rest of us should be. That tzara'at is a categorical name. Much like in the modern world, where we might use the word cancer and use it as a generic term for a collection of different illnesses, tzara'at is not the same in every place where the term is used. Just as cancer is not one particular problem, which is why finding the cure for cancer is not really a scientifically feasible solution. It's like saying find the cure for a virus. There are so many different causes of different types of cancers that there will be many different cures needed, which is why progress in one field may or may not be as helpful in other types of cancer as we might have hoped. So, what does Rambam say further? As, behold, the whitening of a person's skin is called tzara'at, which is the most famous form of tzara'at that is similar in some aspects as leprosy. But the falling out of a little bit of head or beard hair is also called tzara'at. And even the change of the hue of clothing or houses is called tzara'at. Tzara'at can appear in cloth. It can also appear on the walls of a building. No one is believing that that is exactly the same underlying condition as the tzara'at that happens in a person's skin. However, the way that it is treated, the way that there is a presumption of ritual impurity, those are collectively the same, or at least very similar, and so this broad term tzara'at is used. This change mentioned with clothing and houses that the Torah collectively calls tzara'at is not like the way of the world, but rather it is a sign and a wonder that existed in Israel to caution them about evil speech, such that the walls of the one that spoke evil speech would change. So, first half is most important for our topic today, that tzara'at is not like the way of the world. This is speaking in the terms of the Middle Ages. Rambam was 1,000 years ago, after all. When he says the way of the world, he means it's not following nature. This is not a natural phenomenon. This is not just a normal type of illness that you get from being exposed to whatever normal things cause illnesses. This is something exceptional, indeed a sign and a wonder. This is something that is should fill us with awe rather than treated like a mundane illness. He goes on to explain the idea that tzara'at is usually thought of as being connected to lashon hara, evil speech, and I've done many videos about those connections, and you can check them with the Tazria or Meztora back catalog. Now, he goes on to explain then how you actually cure. If he repented, the house would become pure, meaning that the main cure for tzara'at is teshuvah, is repentance. That is how you actually remove tzara'at, which again doesn't work for other types of mundane illnesses. But if he persisted in his evil until his house was broken down, the leather vessels that he would sit and recline upon would change color. If he repented, they would become pure. But if he persisted in his evil until they were burned, his skin would change color, and he would become infested with tzara'at, and he would be isolated, and his condition would be publicized until he would not be involved in the speech of the evildoers, which is mockery and evil speech. So Rambam sees this as being a hierarchy of events, that first there is a blight upon the house, then there is a blight upon the property, the movable property, and then there is a blight on the person himself. And indeed, this is very similar to the ideas that are laid out in the unfolding of the plagues of Egypt, where the attack is not immediately upon the person, but is instead balanced around their property and other comfort in order to try and encourage teshuvah, repentance. And here, of course, ultimately, once a person is being personally afflicted, then they would turn from what they had done, even if they had not repented earlier than this. And we as a species can be exceptionally stubborn. And about this matter, the Torah cautions and says, beware of the plague of Tzara'at. Remember that which the Lord your God did to Miriam on the way, which is a reference to Miriam, who was indeed afflicted to Tzara'at. When she had spoken against Moses, this was part of her punishment. She did teshuvah and it went away, but we can see that even Miriam was affected. As he explains, behold, it is saying, reflect upon what happened to Miriam the prophetess, who spoke about her brother. She was older than him and raised him on her knees and endangered herself to save him at the sea, and she did not speak in his derision, but rather erred in comparing him to other prophets. And he was not even exacting about all of these things, as it is stated in Numbers 12. Then the man Moshe was very humble. And nonetheless, despite the fact that she was as great and had every reason why in normal times we would imagine that she could make these comments, and even when she wasn't saying them to be insulting, she just made a mistake, thinking that he was like everyone else, meaning the other prophets. Even still, she was immediately punished with Tzara'at. All the more so it is with silly evil people who frequently speak boastfully and about supposed wonders. Therefore, it is fitting for the one who wants to guide his ways to distance himself from their gatherings and from speaking with them, so as not to be snagged by the net of evildoers and their foolishness. So we have a little sleight of hand again. One of the things I love about Rambam is he wrote his Mishnah Torah, the great magnum opus of his law compilation, for the broadest audience possible. He really believed that this would be something that would be in everyone's shelf, that everyone would learn it, that they would be able to refer to it, and then they would know what they needed to know about how to observe the halakha. But even as he wrote it for the broadest audience possible, he drops in little hints here and there, little tidbits, if you will, that are meant to indicate further lines of inquiry and thought, which he then expands upon in Moreh Nevuchim, his great guide for the perplexed, which is a much more philosophical work and less directly aimed at halakha. So what happens here? Well, as he talks about the rather mundane, so to speak, pattern of Tzara'at, and explaining that indeed even someone like Miriam could be subjected to this, which is a reference to the rest of us to reflect that indeed we should watch our own speech, because if Miriam could have this issue, then certainly God would be unhappy if we were doing something, since we are not of her standing. But as he points out, all the more so it is with silly evil people who frequently speak boastfully and about supposed wonders. And you'll note that seems a little odd. Yes, the net of evildoers, their foolishness, the idea of not being arrogant, that seems all par for the course. But what does he mean by people who speak about wonders as being potentially in this category of susceptible to Tzara'at and in need of teshuvah, in need of repentance for their errors? Well, to understand what he means when Rambam says about the evil people that speak about wonders, we're going to have to dive into Moreh Nevuchim. Now, before we do, I need to set you up just a little bit. Moreh Nevuchim is a philosophical work that Rambam did not originally intend to be widely publicized. He considered Moreh Nevuchim, Guide for the Perplexed, to be just for those that were, well, the Nevuchim, those that were perplexed. That if you were doing fine, if you didn't have the challenging questions of a higher understanding of faith in the world, then, you don't need to open up this book. But if you were struggling to understand how God and the world fit together, how we fit together with God in the world, and you were not finding the answers in simple aphorisms and chit-chat, then Moreh Nevuchim was there to help guide you, so that you didn't end up becoming either an atheist or seeking a different faith or violating halakha because you thought you knew better. That it was there to help those who had those deep questions. Now, that meant that for many, many years, Moreh Nevuchim was not often taught, even to those that in my opinion, really did need it. And it has become something of a secondary source for Jewish learning. I would like to argue that I think in the modern world, many of us are facing the same crises of faith that were the perplexed of Rambam's day. And many of us are asking questions or have had questions asked around us that could use a better answer and a better, deeper understanding of these topics, that the simplistic faith that Rambam believed was the average is no longer cutting it in the modern world. And as such, a much wider portion of the population will benefit from the teachings of Moreh Nevuchim. However, I am also aware that this is not an easy text by any means. Many of us are not familiar with thinking deeply, engaging in philosophical inquiry, or of having perhaps superficial ideas that we currently hold on to overturned in ways that are not destructive, but instead, like removing a concrete paver, allows the soil underneath to be exposed to the sun and thus to bring forth new light. Many of us have sealed away certain ideas in our mind, and it is slightly unhealthy. And some of those seals need to be broken open so that we can see the world and God a little bit more clearly, and thus become stronger and more resilient in our faith. With that in mind, let's go ahead and see what he has to say. These passages do not convey the idea that God spoke, thought, reflected, or that he consulted and employed the opinion of other beings, as ignorant persons have believed. So, Rambam is referring all the way back to many of the different passages in the Tanakh, where it seems like God is saying to the heavenly court, or God is consulting with the angels. And indeed, in the beginning of Bereshit, it says, "Let us create man in our image." And there are many who leap upon that as a plural form, indicating that God was taking consultation with some other pantheon, God forbid, with some other trinity, also not a Jewish concept, or even with the angels. Rambam was very adamant that this simply cannot be, because how could the creator be assisted by those whom he created? This is very different philosophically than the idea that I can create a tool, whether it be a rake or a computer program, that can then assist me in doing more work. This would be the equivalent of saying that which needs no assistance, for indeed God is the only thing in all of existence that needs no assistance, made something that he then needed. Well, if he needed it, then he wasn't complete before he made it. And if he wasn't complete before he made it, then he wasn't God, because the definition of God is that God is wholly self-sufficient and not reliant upon anything else in all of existence. Indeed, not reliant upon existence at all, unlike the rest of us. So for Rambam, the idea that God would be holding consultations where perhaps the idea or opinion of this angel or that angel would sway his opinion or decision is simply impossible, because to imagine that would be to imagine that the angel had some insight that was not known to God at the time. And that simply is not what it means for God to be the perfect creator that we believe God to be. Now, so what does that mean then for our overall understanding of these angels? Well, and these passages where it appears to give that indication, they only show that all parts of the universe, even the limbs of animals in their actual form, are produced through angels. For natural forces and angels are identical. All right, let's talk a little bit about that before we get to Rambam's strong language here. So what he is trying to say is, when it looks like God is consulting, referring with, speaking to the angels as though they were partners in God's world, somehow contributing something, we are missing the real point. And, instead, what we should be recognizing is that when God says angels, what he is actually talking about are the natural forces of the world. That the natural force of gravity, the natural force of the electromagnetic spectrum, of the strong force, the weak force in atomic structures, the natural force that creates the interactions within our own bodies of life, those are what God means when God says angels. Those are manifestations of God's will that are perceptible, in some cases, within the world around us. And that is what is meant. They are not separate, independent entities with their own unique existence that are contributing voluntarily or willfully in a way that is not directed by God. To imagine that would be to imagine that God was incomplete without them. And as such, that would be the fundamental flaw of understanding God. And Rambam has some words about people who perhaps argue this point, who do not understand that angels, natural forces, that they are the same thing. He says of them, how bad and injurious is the blindness of ignorance. Say to a person who believed to belong to the wise men of Israel, that he's using that term here as an insult, air quotes before they were invented, that the Almighty sends his angel to enter the womb of a woman and to form there the fetus, he will be satisfied with that account. He will believe it and even find in it a description of the greatness of God's might and wisdom. Although he believes that angels consist of burning fire and is as big as a third part of the universe, yet he considers it possible as a divine miracle. All right, so from the previous text of Mishnah Torah, who are these idiots that are speaking about God's wonders? Well, these are the so-called wise men of Israel, people who put on the air of piety, who pretend to know great things about God's secrets, but in fact are blinding people to God's actual truth. That is what Rambam felt was also a trigger for this sara'at, of acting arrogantly. And what is the example that he gives? Well, apparently in his day, it was not uncommon for people to say, when God wants there to be a baby, he sends the angel into the womb of the woman, and the angel crafts that fetus. And people eat it up. They think, whoa, that's amazing. Imagine an angel there in the womb forming the baby. It's so beautiful and wonderful. But even though with their other statements, they talk about angels being made of fire, which would certainly burn anybody if it entered them, or they talk about the angels being the third the size of the universe, which is never going to fit inside of a womb, they wave their hands and say, it's a miracle. It's a miracle. That's how these giant burning angels can enter into a womb and form a fetus. And Rambam is saying, not only are they wrong, but that form of wrongness is incredibly damaging to the Jewish people, indeed to all people of faith. Because when we look at in God and through that lens of angelic miracles, we miss the real miracle that God has given us, which Rambam begins to describe. But tell him, meaning tell this wise person, that God gave the seed a formative power which produces and shapes the limbs, and that this power is called angel, or that all forms are the result of the influence of the active intellect, and that the latter is an angel, the prince of the world, frequently mentioned by our sages, and he will turn away. So what Rambam is saying is that if you want to see the true miracle in God, you don't look for these fairy tale version of angels. You look at the way God crafted the world, that through the natural working of the body, we can create a new human being. That God created not a giant fiery angel, but tiny cells that contain within them all the instructions needed in order to create new life and a body that is capable of nurturing that life until it grows, and that those are instructions compressed within it that will allow its limbs and form to all be unfolded. And indeed, the entire world around us is being unfolded according to this active intellect, which is sort of philosophers speak for the chief idea of the outpouring of God's law throughout the world in this natural way. And that would be rejected, he says, that people would not like it. They would say, how terrible, you're diminishing God's greatness, that you are not, believing truly in God's beauty and the miracle of God's angels. And yet Rambam is trying to say that they're missing that. And they're missing it, he argues, continuing in the text, because he cannot comprehend the true greatness and power of creating forces that act in a body without being perceived by our senses. So often there is a attachment, an affinity for wanting the miracles to be obvious, to be plain, to be, well, special effects. We want things that we can easily picture and imagine, that fit within the limited sphere of our own imagination, our own intelligence. Because if I can't understand it, then I have a hard time truly appreciating its greatness. And Rambam is saying something here 1,000 years ago, which is even more powerful today, that as we have continued to unravel the mysteries of the hidden world, the underlying forces that shape the world around us, we should not see this as being arguing against God, but instead magnifying the greatness of God beyond even what Rambam could understand. He had glimpses of the hidden world of God's power in this creation, and the way that these angelic forces unfolded the world around us in ways that we can barely even perceive. And yet, when we come across things that are hard for us to understand, whether that be the outlying edges of physics or of medical science, we tend to recoil and want to retreat into the comforting picture of fluffy angels that are somehow doing the real miracles. The real miracle is in the shape of the world itself, its underlying fabric, the warp and woof, which gets mentioned so much when talking about Sara'at in the clothing. That is where the real miracles are. The angels are literally embedded within each and every one of us. They are pulling at us constantly with all of the forces around us that make our world. And that is the much greater miracle. Rambam goes on, because he knows this is a controversial topic, to continue to justify this belief. Our sages have already stated, for him who has understanding, meaning if you actually read it carefully, that all forces that reside in a body are angels. And remember, when he says body, he doesn't just mean a human body, flesh and blood. He also means a body like a piece of rock, any material shape. If it's got form, it's a body. Much more the forces that are active in the universe. The theory that each force acts only in one particular way, which was expressed in Bereshit Rabbah as follows: one angel does not perform two things, and two angels do not perform one thing. This is a very famous midrash when talking about the angels who visit Abraham. This is exactly the property of all forces, meaning that's not talking about angels as though they are just somehow discrete messengers. That is a fair description of forces, of the things that govern the world. We may find a confirmation of the opinion that the natural and psychical forces of an individual are called angels in the statement of our sages, which is frequently quoted and occurs originally in Bereshit Rabbah. Every day God creates a legion of angels. They sing before him and disappear. When, in opposition to the statement, other statements were quoted to the effect that angels are eternal, and in fact it has repeatedly been shown that they live permanently, the reply has been given that some angels live permanently, others perish. And this is really the case from the right point of view. For individual forces are transient, whilst the genre are permanent and imperishable. So meaning the particular force, we'll just use gravity because it's the easiest one for most of us to hold on to, the particular force of gravity that is exerted on me by, well, at the moment, by my chair, it's the thing I am closest to, that particular form of gravity would disappear if my chair disappeared. But gravity itself would still exist. That the gravity as a fundamental force of the universe, that as an angel of the universe, is always there, but the particular expression of that force comes and goes depending upon the unique circumstances of the world at any given moment. So indeed, God created these eternal angels, these eternal forces that give shape and order to the universe, but the individual expressions are constantly flickering on and off as the world continues to move through its existence in time. When, sorry, I already read that line, they're permanently, and others would jump. Right. Again, we read in Bereshit Rabbah, this time chapter 85, in reference to the relation between Judah and Tamar, Rabbi Yochanan said that Judah was about to pass by without noticing Tamar, but God caused the angel of lust, i.e. the libidinous disposition, to present himself to him. Man's disposition, here our own internal mental state, is called an angel. Likewise, we frequently meet with the phrase, the angel set over a certain thing. In Midrash Kohelet, that's the Midrash on the book of Ecclesiastes, the following passage occurs. When man sleeps, his soul speaks to the angel to the cherub. The intelligent reader will find here a clear statement that man's imaginative faculty is also called angel, and that the cherub is used for man's intellectual faculty. How beautiful must this appear to him who understands it, how absurd to the ignorant. So again, going back to Rambam's statement about the evil fools, he sees that when people want to reject this notion, want to see in this idea of the soul speaking to an angel as though there was the fluffy winged creature, rather than recognizing this is speaking to the imaginative faculty that is imbued within us as one of the fundamental forces of our own existence, people just don't want to hear that. They're much happier with the simple idea of my soul talking to a fluffy angel, rather than recognizing that there's a deeper, more powerful understanding of what God has placed within us, whether it be talking to the imagination or whether it be talking to our lust, that yes, there are angels, there are forces within us that we are in constant relationship with, sometimes seeking to draw closer, and sometimes, such as lust, seeking to draw away from. Then that is not personified in the usual cartoon version of angel, where they, have a little devil on the shoulder and a little angel on the other shoulder. It's not that they are whispering into our ears because they themselves are uniquely willful or have volition. It is because we have these constant powers within us wrestling over us the same way that gravity is wrestling over us. And we have to exert our own energy to resist as needed, or to move in the direction that we are being pulled when correct and right. The same way that we use our own force to resist gravity when we need to, like standing up, and we can use it to guide us when we should be doing something else, like lying down and going to sleep. So these angels are not, they are not what get painted on the Sistine Chapel, but they are something far more beautiful. No offense to Michelangelo. He did the best he could. All right. So as we bring ourselves to our conclusion, we need to, just a moment, I just want to double check. I realized that I've gone quite a while without checking my YouTube questions. Nope, nobody's got something there. Let's go ahead. We're going to finish off with one more guide for the perplexed, and then we'll bring it back to Tzara'at for the end. Now, you already know that it is very difficult for people to apprehend, to truly understand, except after strenuous training, which is why if you are feeling a little lost, that's okay. You can certainly watch this again, or indeed go study Guide for the Perplexed and dig into it more deeply. And as always, ask me questions if you would like. That which is absolutely devoid of physicality. This is the hardest topic. Right? When we talk about things that we can easily see and touch, the cup, the pen, the moon, it's easy to talk about them. Indeed, this is one of the great attractions of idolatry, is by being physical, it makes it easy to think we know what's going on. However, we know, because God is not physical, that there is a non-physical element to existence and, of course, to God, and that understanding that is going to be exceedingly difficult, because I have more in common with the moon than I do with God. And that means that I can understand the moon a lot more easily than I can understand God. Because of the difficulty of this matter, the books of the prophets contain statements whose external sense can be understood as signifying that angels are corporeal, that angels have bodies, that they move, that they have human form, that they are given orders by God and that they carry out God's orders as though they were individual people. Indeed, we use the word tsevaot, the hosts of heaven, which is a term used for the armies of the world. It's a great metaphor for helping us bridge the gap between us being physical and God, and thus angelic existence being non-physical. It helps us to use physical metaphors, but we must never mistake the metaphor for the reality. We must never think that the metaphor's physical elements are what we should be focusing on. They are useful for getting us from being, well, ignorant of a topic to scratching the surface of understanding the non-physicality of the world, but we should not take the wrong elements of that metaphor as being the focus. When we talk about angels as an army, don't think of them as being the actual physical rank and file of soldiers. Think of them as being the force which God projects in order that his will be done, which is what an army actually is, whether it's made up by a rank and file of soldiers or whether it's made up by the forces. So this hopefully will help you understand why so much of the Torah seems to give an impression, so much of the Tanakh seems to give an impression, so much of rabbinic literature seems to give an impression that angels are walking around on 2 or 1 feet and various numbers of wings, that those are not meant to be the actual point of those descriptions. It's just to be pointing us towards a deeper understanding of each of those metaphors, which will hopefully guide us to a deeper understanding of God. Now, coming back to our question of Tzara'at, we're going to look at Nachmanides, also known as Ramban, and he said, this is not a natural earthly phenomenon, meaning the Tzara'at. Just as in the case of house leprosy, rather when Israel is one with God, God's spirit is always upon them to keep their bodies and their garments and houses appearing good. But when one of them sins or transgresses, an ugliness appears in his body or his garment or his house to show that God has left him. So Ramban, who is not quite as much of a rationalist as Rambam, nonetheless still sees Tzara'at as not being a regular earthly phenomenon, but still as being a reflection about our relationship with God. That indeed, through these forces, that we are reflected the same way that gravity can act upon me, though I can't see it. Likewise, the angels, the forces of God, the laws of the world that God has created can affect down to my body. And in the ancient world, when Tzara'at was occurring, can cause the physical manifestations that are described in its in its identification and in its removal. This topic of Tzara'at is so often seen as being a debasement of theology because it is physical. But what Ramban is adding here, built upon everything that I just mentioned from Rambam, is the idea that the physical is not the opposite of God, and the physical is not the opposite of good spirituality, that the physical is indeed intertwined. It is in fact constructed by these angelic forces, and not constructed in the way that you might think of tiny angels with a hammer and saw, but through the forces that God wove into the world. And as we continue to discover and explore more of God's creation, to understand more of the laws of physics or chemistry, biology, or any of the other elements of this physical existence, we are uncovering more and more of what God has designed into the world. And that also applies to our own psychological state. As Rambam mentioned, whether it be our lust, whether it be our imagination, whether it be our intellectual capacity, these are also being influenced by the God's ultimate desire for us to rise up and understand ourselves, our world better. Because in doing so, we draw closer to God through these levers. We don't need a fairy tale version or a cartoon version or a superficial version of what angels are. In fact, when we rely too much on that, we put a barrier between ourselves and God. rather than writing back these channels of understanding that God has specifically made us capable of understanding. But that does mean rolling up our mental sleeves and doing the work. So thank you all so much for joining. I don't know if anybody has any questions. I'll check the YouTube as well. I don't see anybody putting them in the YouTube comments. But we will not be meeting next week because next week is Pesach. And hopefully you'll be enjoying services either with us at PI or whatever synagogue you happen to be involved with. So I will see you back here for more Torah study in 2 weeks. Take care, everyone, and be well.